Sin's devastating results. In view of the power of sin, we should not be surprised how human beings progressively violate God's moral laws and suffer the consequences. Here's Gene.
All of us are aware of the fact that sin, the presence of sin, is a powerful force in this world. We've all seen it. We've experienced it to one degree or another. And consequently, it shouldn't surprise us that when we look at what's happening, even in our own culture, we can see the impact of the power of sin, particularly in the deterioration of our values. Paul addressed this when he wrote to the Romans. And you'll notice I call it the power of sin in Romans 1:21 and going through verse 23. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. And basically, what he is saying here is that over a process of time, generations change, and there is a deterioration in that culture, in that society, even within one generation. Paul goes on to describe what happens to people. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling, now notice the deterioration here, mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. That's a progression downward. Mortal man. If you go to the museums that focus on the Roman culture at that time, all of the images, the statuary of worshiping mortal man, including the emperors themselves. From that point forward, a downward progression. Now, Paul, first of all, is addressing the Roman world. He's addressing what was happening right in that world. But I believe that he was also referring to history. He was referring, for example, to what happened in the time of Noah, when there was no one righteous in the world. He's referring to the time of Abraham, when no one was righteous, and God chose him out of that pagan culture, God's grace. It happened in Israel. All you need to do is read about the kings of Israel, the northern tribes. For example, Jeroboam. In fact, some of us were recently in Israel, and we visited the very areas where Jeroboam set up golden calves because he didn't want the people to go to Jerusalem because he was in conflict with Rehoboam, who was king of the south. And you see, evil. In fact, there was not one righteous king in Israel of the northern tribes, not one. So you see this happening in Israel, this deterioration. Then come the Assyrians, who, by the way, took the northern tribes into captivity. Then you have the Babylonians, who took the southern kingdom into captivity. You have the Medo-Persians, who took over the Babylonians. And then you have the Greeks, which leads up to the time of the Romans. So I think that Paul is really referring not just to the present Roman situation, but to history. But it's more than history. It refers to our present culture. And you look at what's happening in our present world, in our own society. And I was thinking about this. I pulled a $5 bill out of my billfold not too long ago, in fact, about an hour ago. And I looked at that bill and it said, "In God we trust." And then I thought about the Supreme Court. On the outside of the Supreme Court, right up above, you have three individuals, and right in the center, facing, is Moses with the Ten Commandments. Supreme Court. You go inside, there are two big oak doors. At the bottom of those doors, the 10 Commandments. You see where the judges sit, and above them, the 10 Commandments. That's the Supreme Court of the United States. Look at what has happened. Look at what has happened in our particular culture. And so we see the same process taking place. The interesting thing is that it only takes one generation for degeneration to take place. We see that in Israel. For example, the first generation in Joshua's day, the people worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua. They had seen all the Lord's great works he had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and that whole generation was also gathered to their ancestors. But notice the second generation. Hard to believe until you see what's happening in our own culture. After them, another generation rose up who did not know the Lord or the works he had done for Israel. That's incredible. One generation for degeneration to take place. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshiped the Baals and abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. And so we see this degeneration taking place. And the fascinating thing here in Romans, Paul says that eventually, when there is no response to God's grace, and people choose to move from this truth to this paganism, that people become victims of their own evil choices. And that's what Paul describes. Notice again, a downward spiral. God delivered them over in the desires of their heart to sexual impurity. And there you have God's gift of sex, the natural gift, the natural use, being perverted. The next step, God delivered them over to disgraceful passions, unnatural uses of the gift that God has given sexually. And thirdly, God delivered them over to a corrupt mind. And there he describes all kinds of evil, wickedness that takes place within that culture as a result of this downward spiral. So we see here that within not just the Roman world, this was happening in the Roman world, but it happened throughout history, and it's even being repeated in societies that once were built upon really the biblical ethic that we see in the Old and the New Testament. So it shouldn't surprise us what's happening, because it's happened throughout history. So here's a reflection response question. How have we seen this process work in our own culture? Well, go back to the 1960s. Most of you in this room can remember the 60s. That was an interesting time, wasn't it? You know what happened? The decisions of the Supreme Court. From the 60s on, the decisions regarding life, abortion, the decisions that were made relative to pornography. Look what has happened. It has become a plague throughout the whole world, and right now one of the greatest concerns is pornography and its impact upon marriage in very destructive force. Even in some of your most primitive cultures where they have the internet and are accessing all kinds of pornography. It's a worldwide phenomena that's bringing deterioration within our culture and away from God's design. And so we see the power of this happening even within our own culture today, not within just our society, but within the world culture. And so consequently, we need to think about what is happening. But the good news is, and it's hard to sometimes see this, but the darker the world becomes, the brighter our light can shine. If we don't allow ourselves to be folded into that culture and to be conformed to the world rather than being continually transformed. And also taking very seriously what God said to Israel through Moses before they went into Canaan. He said this. This is Deuteronomy 6. Listen, Israel. That's called the Great Shema in Hebrew. Listen, Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. This is Moses talking to the children of Israel there, which is recorded in Deuteronomy, the last words that he really delivered to them before they entered the Promised Land. He said, talk about them when you sit in your house. Naturally, it should be a part of who you are in your conversation. And when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. There are so many opportunities that we have with our children to bring God into the picture in a natural way, rather than to set them down and saying, we're going to teach you how to live, but to teach how to live in the context of life. And this is what Moses is really talking about. And so what that simply says, I think, for us today in a culture that is indeed deteriorating worldwide, we need strong families. And we really need to give attention to that. And God can enable us by His Spirit if indeed we put Him first. And we need strong churches. And this is the phenomena of the New Testament, that not only can you have strong families, but strong families can give birth to strong churches, to be light in a world that is indeed moving away from His will. So here's the principle. In view of the power of sin, we should not be surprised how human beings progressively violate God's moral laws and suffer the consequences. But of course, we could add to that principle and say, we need to be able to be light in this world in order that God might use us to bring hope to those who are walking away from God, and hopefully will turn to God because of our faithfulness and our witness in this world.